pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth,
Billy Corgan, Billy Corgan, Billy Corgan. Is he going to open the Straits of Hormuz? No, he's probably not going to do that. But he does have a podcast. It's called The Magnificent Others, and it's not bad at all. I got to give it to him. I was never a fan of them in the day, surprisingly, for someone who likes 80s metal bands with unusual vocals. I never took to the vocal style. Just wasn't my generation. Smashing Pumpkins, Alice in Chains, all that kind of thing. But his podcast is pretty good. He's a pretty intelligent guy, apart from the weird blind spot where he seems to be a big fan of wrestling, which mystifies me. But recently he made some statements I think have been gaining a bit of traction in the whole rock metal world, more or less suggesting that the reason why rock and metal isn't popular anymore, that in the 90s there was a kind of a dastardly plan by the labels and by various different institutions of power and governance within the music industry to try and sideline rock and metal. So rather than solve the Middle East, let's leave that for another week. I'm going to talk about that. So let's get into it.
We used to drink a lot. We lived in a sort of strange state of excitement. Always off balance, high-pitched, tense, always just at the breaking point.
Now you can follow me at nemthianga_primordial over on Instagram, primordial_official. Also to see, well, both sets of not that exciting adventures. The adventures of old, middle-aged men grappling with a new technology, trying to understand the algorithm. Hey, it just doesn't work for you anymore. The podcast itself gets more and more views all the time. So I am looking openly for sponsors. Whether you're a brand who want to become affiliated with the podcast, all that kind of thing, or you're in a band out there thinking, this is the way to reach a captive audience. We're pushing, I think, 1 million plays or more of the podcast, and every day, hundreds and hundreds. So, get in touch. So, you might have noticed it, and we've discussed it here on the podcast before, and I've said it quite openly. And very often when I've said it, well, not very often, but I think every time, no one has really disagreed with me, unless they're in the mood to just be pedantic and disagree with me on a point of principle, which I understand because I'm irritating sometimes. But that this is the first decade in mainstream music where there is no angry white boys with guitars making rock music. It just isn't. And I'm not just talking about heavy metal. It could be, you look back at the Korns and the Limp Bizkits, look back at that Woodstock documentary on Netflix, Korn and Limp Bizkit, look at the cultural zeitgeists of the day. It could be Green Day, it could be whatever. Marilyn Manson. I'm not just talking about heavy metal here. I'm not just talking about Manowar in their loincloths and their greased appendages on MTV in 1992, although I'm going to get round to talking about MTV as part of this conspiracy that Billy Corgan is alluding to. But you may have noticed it, and it's been something that I've seen commentators on other podcasts like This Is Entertainment and a few others of the generation after myself wondering, where did all the bands go? Where did all the bands go? It's not the first time that someone, an aunt or an uncle, has asked me in a sort of innocent way, where did all the bands go, and then isn't quite prepared for my answer on these things. There's lots of boring reasons. There's lots of socio-political, cultural reasons. I even think you can broadly stretch it to even incorporate, such contentious issues as immigration. Now, whether we get to that, let's see. But the truth is that for the first time, I think in any decade, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, mainstream music just doesn't have, I think, a place for guitar music. Now, Billy Corgan is saying that it started in the 90s. So let's go back to there and let's just have a look at what he means. Now, I can say, anecdotally, that I have a mutual friend who used to work with lots and lots of big labels in the 80s. All of the big kind of labels doing promo, running promo for them. And this is back in the day when bands like Dokken and stuff used to spend they used to drop like $150,000 on a video to hire a helicopter to appear over LA or something like this. You know, a band could just concentrate more or less on writing music. Okay, so they had a lot of appointments, whether it was with guitar magazines, whether it was with whatever. But there was a production team, there was an advertising team, there was a promotion team behind them, just pushing everything in all these different directions, trying to get coverage. Nowadays, the way it kind of works is you release your album, the label goes, okay, we put some ads up, we do a few things online, but it's really kind of up to you. And you have to be your own promo. So if you're no good, as I alluded to Primordial not being really any good at Instagram and all those kind of things, because it's just not your generation to be constantly making content, which is what the algorithm is requiring. Now, of course, there are some arguments to say that for certain bands it just doesn't matter, and what you're doing is chasing a chimera, a myth, something that doesn't really exist. And as an example, I went to see the band Black Braid recently. And this is, what we could call a young person's band. And there's no problem with that. And the truth is that I looked at the crowd who was there to see them and who got very excited at their appearance. And I thought to themselves, there isn't an algorithmic way within which a band who is 25 years older, such as Primordial, makes those kids go, wow, I better get into them. Young people need their own bands, and that's just how it is. And sometimes chasing that algorithm can be a bit vulgar and a bit embarrassing, but yet at the same time, when you make an album, you're required to kind of be your own promo, to let people know when there are gigs, to let people know what's happening, and to just constantly make content, which then the label can just repurpose or just repost. So things changed a lot back in the day, though. Labels had huge production teams, and a friend of mine worked at a huge label in the early 90s when the ground shifted underneath their industry 3 times in a row, let's say. Well, it's 2 times, but the first one was the changing of the guard when it came to grunge coming in and killing hair metal. Most people who are not of that age don't really realize what happened when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out. But it more or less sounded the death knell. I nearly said molested, but you could probably say that. And molested the futures of lots of hair rock bands. 1991, there was still albums rolling in from Firehouse and Warrant and Dokken and all these kind of bands. But as soon as those opening chords of Smells Like Teen Spirit hit MTV and that video in the gymnasium and all that kind of stuff, and I remember seeing it at the time, and you were aware, as somebody at the time in 91, 1990 who wasn't really into hair metal, it wasn't my thing, you were aware, oh, I see what's coming. You could see what's coming. There was a cultural, social change that was vast. People were not interested in the sort of cocaine Reaganomics of the 1980s and excess and Gordon Gekko and everything that the 1980s epitomized, which was, well, fun, especially for American hair metal. This was just out the door. And one could say, in a way, that American bands, grunge bands in a way, Alice in Chains and stuff like this, they inherited the gloom. One could say, in a way, that English bands such as The Cure, The Smiths, Depeche Mode, maybe 10 years on from the Joy Divisions of this world, which was the doom and gloom that followed a very racked industrial collapse of the 1970s Britain. You had the IMF, you had coming in the International Monetary Fund coming into the UK, you had race riots, you had all these kind of things. And when you hear the Specials or Joy Division or early Cure or something, you hear the Smiths is the sound of suburbia. And maybe it took a while for it to be, transmogrified and manipulated through into an American sense. Could it be through bands like R.E.M. or College Radio? But by the time 1990 rolls around, I think there's a sea change and people are fucking sick of Ain't Nothing But a Good Time. Okay, so those bands lived to tell the tale. It took them a while. They had to weather the storm in the 1980s. But people just got tired of that kind of thing, that sort of sunshine cocaine lifestyle. After all, it was what ruined Black Sabbath, was it not? You can hear the beauty of Black Sabbath is in the industrial heartland of the north of England, of misery and grey ash clouds and rain and cold. And that is epitomised in the opening riffs of the song Black Sabbath. And when Black Sabbath went, you know what, we could just live in California in a big mansion in the sunshine and do coke all day. And that's when you begin to get, this is where Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy and that kind of stuff comes from. Dirty Women. You can hear the difference. And somehow in the early 90s when grunge hit, it just changed. People wanted Alice in Chains. They didn't want Poison anymore. And you get it. You understand why. But that was the sea change number one. And the labels quickly followed, trying to sign every alternative rock or guitar band, trying to make stars of Dinosaur Jr. and all these kind of bands. But there was also another change that followed very quickly on from that. And that's where my anecdote before we get to the likes of Billy Corgan comes in. But a friend of mine told me that, two friends of mine, a he and a she, in the early, let's say 92, 93, 94, they were kind of sworn to secrecy. You could sign legal terms of discussion and non-disclosure of what you can and cannot discuss about what you see in a boardroom. And they were, one day, this guy came in with a big board and lots of different coloured pens, and everybody had to sit around the boardroom and explain to them that they were about to meet a rapper, a hip-hop singer, and he was going to explain to them that they had a coterie, that he had a whole bunch of artists that he was going to work with. Basically, this big label were buying over a hip-hop label, and they'd concocted a plan, and this was to sell the danger of urban black culture to white middle-class kids. And they came in and they explained, this is what we're going to do. These are the rappers like Tupac. I don't know if you've ever watched the video of Tupac when he's just a drama student and he's an entirely different person. And whatever happened to him after that, I don't know. But what went on in that boardroom was basically the creation, the backstory of some of the hip-hop guys and some of the people they were going to work with, i.e. it was fabricated, it was fake. Not to say, of course, all of that music isn't, but just like as in black metal in the early to mid-90s, some bands believed in the power of the Dark Lord, and some bands were just LARPing. Same with everything, really. But what they sat down and witnessed was, again, another sea change in the music industry, and that was the music industry was about to pivot. MTV was about to drop its Headbangers Ball. It was about to drop its rock programming almost altogether, which is one of the things that what really did for rock in the 1990s. But there was going to be a discernible pivot towards hip-hop. And so these people who worked in the artist management area of the label, they were going to have to learn the backstories of these particular artists. They were going to have to learn the new places they could promote them. I heard stories about, trainer and runner companies, being involved in all sorts of external third parties who they weren't used to when they were promoting rock bands. Basically what they were told is, look, forget what you were working about with that new Dokken album, with that new Firehouse album. You've already seen what grunge is going to do. We're separating the music industry now. You may have been working on the new, I don't know, Mother Love Bone album, but now it's going to be more or less exclusively this. And I think it heralded a sort of demise of rock music in the mainstream. And that's what they did. They sat down in that boardroom and they were told, okay, this guy who's going to come in and talk to you now, we're going to create his backstory, where he was in prison, how many times he was shot, all this kind of stuff. Now, of course, in the 1990s, that was easier to do than it would be now. Now, trying to do anything like that where people can access all of those things would be very, very difficult. But you can go back and watch that Tupac video where he's certainly not the rugged gangster that he became.
A rare and infuriating... Have you ever met someone so catastrophically foolish that all reason in you paused, and the only thought left was the urge to reach out and smack the stupidity right off their face? A rare and infuriating...
However, what I'm saying does sound a bit like a conspiracy, but let's consider this. Billy Corgan recently floated the idea that the music industry effectively conspired to keep rock off the air, suppressing the genre. A provocative claim. So let's try and go back into the 90s and have a little examination of that. And what does suppression mean? Now, I've just told you, and this is something that in in Billy Corgan's statements, he's not exactly pointing to a conspiracy. But like I said, that particular story which was told to me would be what you would frame under the word conspiracy, that people came in and said, okay, let's go and create a false narrative to sell the danger of hip-hop to white suburban kids. Radio consolidation changed the game. And this is kind of important. After the 1996, I did a bit of looking into this. After the 1996 Telecommunications Act in the US, a couple of companies controlled a huge chunk of radio. Fewer programmers meant tighter, safer playlists. I used to work for a short while for a radio station, and I saw this even myself. What happened is that people realized that you didn't need an independent playlist operative in your station, and you just imported those playlists. And many playlists chased adult-friendly pop and rhythmic tracks that test well in short call-outs. That basically tested well in the rooms. Guitar-centric songs, which often take longer to land, got less space. I think you could probably have the same conversation about heavy metal as you had for country and western. And that for real country and western fans, this horrific post-Garth Brooks country style that you see now that dominates everything, again, this is what tested well. So what happened is that college radio in the States got bought over during the Telecommunications Act. Independent radio stations got bought over, and they weren't allowed anymore to just program in unusual songs, which became hits, which people hooked into. And basically it all just reverted to the lowest common dumb denominator. And most people like awful music, and that's kind of what happened. Payola, by another name in the mid. So that's 1996, really changed things. We could say MTV already by 92, 93 had started to take rock off the air. Headbangers Ball, which had been a huge thing for rock and metal, just disappeared. And all of a sudden, the birth of reality TV. I don't remember the name of the MTV show, but that really just began to take over everything. And people realized this is cheap TV, cheap to make, and we just film people dancing by the side of on the beach. And this replaces the kind of huge exposure that bands could get by making unusual videos. I recently watched on Netflix the documentary about the band Devo, which is really amazing. I would recommend it. It gave me a great respect for them, and how they were just a sort of strange art collective in the early 1970s. I didn't realize they were that old. I suppose a contemporary to Kraftwerk in many senses. But their interest in early video is what broke them in the early 1980s. And you realize by the mid-1990s that could just never happen. What it is just, I suppose, the same in a microculture, or I suppose it's pretty, the music industry is a big thing, so it was a kind of macro culture, really. But the conglomeration of ownership, the squeezing out of independent voices, and so therefore rock just ended up going by the by. In the mid-2000s, major labels settled investigations over radio promotion practices, and access to spins depended on promotion and all these internal relationships, but there was just so many more gatekeepers. The Billboard charts evolution towards streaming and I guess social virality made hip-hop and pop surge. These are genres with faster release cycles, heavy features and strong presence on TikTok and YouTube. And I mean, this is really what we're talking about in the modern day, and maybe, a little bit after Corgan's time. But as I said before, it's very hard to market a band to young people. 5 faces, it just doesn't work. So therefore, everybody is looking at their phone, and so just one artist singular. You'll notice on festivals, you go and look at a festival poster right now, and it's just a whole lot of names of people. It's not bands anymore, because that name is what people search for, and it's one person. They're easier to promote, and what they're promoting is easier when you just have one voice and one face. Also points to the fact that because people are spending so much time on their phone, that vocal-driven music is what's popular because that's what's easy to make. And as the guy who creates Suno, which could be the destruction of the music industry, or creatively, he was being interviewed and he just said, it's a bit of a pain in the arse learning how to play the guitar. People don't want to do it anymore. They just want to input it in and get their song. Let's also take a look. I think audience tastes just shifted. In the 90s, rock and alt music defined youth culture. In the 2010s and 2020s, hip-hop, Latin and, Afro beats took that kind of role. That's not really a conspiracy. That's just taste cycles and demographics. But they're also mirrored in the digital algorithm, the way that it promotes certain things. And, algorithms mirror behavior. If younger listeners replay rap and pop more, streaming models will surface more of it. It's just, again, the conglomeration of ownership. Rock's core is older and more album-focused, and the album is just basically a done deal now. It's almost becoming an albatross around the necks of rock and metal music. Of course, artistically, the death of the album is something we should really view very tragically, but I can see that the streaming numbers between song 1 and song 8 on an album, when you release it now, they could be a 10th or 20th of what they were when people started. So let's try and go back to the 90s a bit more. In the 90s, rock had a cultural dominance. Grunge and alt, as I said, were mainstream youth culture. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden, even Radiohead. They're not niche acts, they were the centre. Gateways. And the gateways, MTV and alt radio, were really powerful with a high tolerance at the time for guitars and artist development. And that's something interesting, artist development. SoundScan, which, counted sales in the early 90s, boosted rock by accurately reflecting sales. And the labels invested in long arcs. This is quite interesting. Album cycles, tour support, alternative press. There's no such thing as tour support anymore. Tour support used to be when the label would put money into putting you out on tour. And so the bands didn't necessarily have to lose money by going on tour. You absolutely lose money now by going on tour. The overheads and the costs are so high. And if you were to bring up tour support to a label, I think they would just laugh at you. It's just, this is your risk now. All the risks are placed upon a band. Whereas before, there was an industry and a scene that would be supportive of a band and try and nurture them. It's pretty simple now that all of those risks are placed more or less upon the musician. It's up to you to try and get in the back of the van, and where you're not going to get anything to make that any harder or any easier. Forgive my cheese brain. No, we're not going to support you financially to make that easier. And also just add in all the just general pressures of the cost of living in the 2020s and the 2010s compared to 1981, 82, and all that kind of thing. It makes it everything so much harder when it comes to rents, buying houses, places to rehearse. I've often said it before, even in the city centres, in Dublin city centre, there's no rehearsal rooms really. There's a few, but there's not compared to what there used to be. Trying to book a venue is very difficult because different, Chinese investment firms own the centre of Dublin city. Finding a room to bash around in and play guitar is not easy anymore. And if you do, it could be 60 or 80 euro for 2 or 3 hours. If you're a kid, you don't have that money. You might as well make music with your phone, just speaking straight into your phone. That's just kind of all of these, the clutter that surrounds being in a band, which is all the gear, all the guitars, all the amps, all that kind of stuff. This has become just detritus. Expensive detritus that is just too much for most people. Streaming, of course, changed everything. Streaming prioritizes repeatable singles, short songs, fast hooks, frequent releases, and that favors pop and hip-hop workflows. Discovery power has moved from MTV and the radio to TikTok, to YouTube, and just playlists. Again, metal was left behind by playlists. If you go and look at the new rock playlist, I guarantee you, if you are, while I'm sitting here recording this podcast wearing a Funeral Mist t-shirt, I guarantee you, if you're wearing any sort of t-shirt from there on into one of the Dante's rings of the Inferno, you will not know a single name on rock's new playlist. Visual virality and creator culture drive hits. Rock bands aren't always built for that pace, and that's true. Radio formats aged up. Rock radio skews older, leaning on catalogue. Current rock exposure narrows. And you see this in the way that Youngblood, this guy, was pushed on the rock audience. And the rock audience, by and large, went, not for us. I don't think so. After that Aussie appearance, he was wheeled out as the great white rock hope, the great rock hope of, for rock music. And then you listen to his albums and you think, well, this is really just pop music with its small smattering of guitars and some parts lifted from Bowie and parts lifted from this and the other. It's not really a band. Again, it's pushed and forced on his individual particular personality. So let's consider it. Let's consider it brutally. The promotion of a band on an Instagram, for example, by and large, it's too many people, too many faces for young people to resonate with. A band is simply too difficult to promote. There's no video, TV, etc. Rock is now nostalgia, and it's not going to go round. People think it's all cyclical, but I don't think it's cyclical because the technology has changed too much. Kids talk into their phones, so it makes sense that vocal-led music has become the most popular. If you ever scroll through Instagram and feel you can feel your brain glaze over at a band post, and that's 5 faces, 5 mini brands, 5 different attempts at being relatable. I'm talking about mainstream culture here now. While a single creator with a ring light and a story racks up 1 million views very easily. Today, the mainstream door is almost completely closed on rock music. Not because rock music got worse. I mean, we could argue that it has, but at the same time, there are brilliant underground bands, but they're more or less at the level that we know right here on the podcast, like AGITATORS Anonymous that we talk about. But some of those bands could have been huge in the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, off the top of my head, a band like Brutus or something, And simple, the loss of TV being an influence, and fewer kids learning instruments and constant scrutiny that kills mystique. This is something that's important, is that just everyone knowing everything about everything all of the time, and you have a culture that is totally tilted away from rock music by default. Because social media, what it's asking is, who am I connecting with right now? Not what music am I discovering? Because music has become the rather than being the soundtrack to your life, it's become the backdrop to people's lives. The algorithm pushes a person and not a collective. A solo artist offers one story, one look, one stream of behind-the-scenes intimacy. A band offers a sort of algorithmic negotiation. Whose voice leads the TikTok? Who is the brand? Listeners, they just sort of don't care. And that's the fucking most depressing and sad thing about this. When the top of the funnel is a 7-second clip and a face in selfie mode, a band's value, chemistry, interplay, arrangement, all those kind of things, they just don't translate in time. Meanwhile, a solo creator can deliver, that hook, the whole thing in a single shot. And so the new A&R artist development is just solely for a singular artist. And that's one of the reasons why rock has just fallen so severely off the face of the cliff. A vocal-led, personality-forward, fast to produce and iterate. And, let's be honest, music that is almost very easy for Suno and all of the digital platforms to recreate easily. I think we're going to reach a phase where someone like, some of those big artists are just going to be licensing out their image, and that Suno and other song generators are literally going to create 20 songs for them a year. All they're going to have to do is learn how to mime to them when they go to play the concerts, and no one is going to give a shit. If you think Taylor Swift fans are going to care about whether there's 10 songwriters or one, and that one is called Suno, I think everyone is mistaken. And that's, of course, where ultimately it just leads to this even greater squeezing out of rock music from the mainstream. And the other big thing is that the phone essentially becomes the instrument where once the guitar was, and that's why the voice wins. Young people's creativity is phone native. Write a verse, hum a top line into voice memos, stack ad-libs, post. It's immediate, intimate, and inexpensive. And this is what makes it. Compare that to being in a rock band, which is forming a band, rehearsing, finding a garage, booking a show. It's a logistical tax on participation, if you understand what I mean. Voice first, music flourishes in this environment, and also because people are listening to music just on their phones. They're not listening through, I have expensive speakers sitting here in front of me. They're just not listening to music through that. So that's why rap, R&B, pop, singer-songwriter, bedroom, EDM, one human, one camera, output. That works. And that means that rock is just in a very precarious place for anyone to latch onto it anymore, for it to have any voice when it compares to just this instant way of communicating. And this was what matches the algorithm's appetite. And it's not going to change. So when I argue with people, they go, oh, it'll come round again. I just don't think it will. I think it's just so far out of the public consciousness. Schools cut music in programs. Guitar sales skew older. Practice is a slow burn in a culture that rewards publish now, refine in public, which is true. It's not, it's just the kind of gravity of the situation. Fewer kids learn bands' instruments, fewer bands emerge. Here's something that's important. Rock music used to feed on mystique. Look back at those bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and stuff. Its scrutiny isn't rock friendly. Rock mythology used to feed on distance, tall tales, rumor, aura. Today, every moment is content. Every slip is a screenshot. The same surveillance that builds trust for solo careers can flatten a band's mystique. And this is true. And I often think about that, even on the small terms of Primordial in relation to doing a podcast, mentioning, does anybody really need my opinion on the songwriting structures of Taylor Swift? They fucking don't. On every band has to be on Instagram. But like, we can't all be Mugwa. But does it kill our mystique? Most definitely. But yet at the same time, you try and release an album on a label and they go, so what? You've got no social media at all. What the fuck do we work with as a promo? So every band is in a sort of this, kind of death of 1,000 cuts of the slow manipulation of this process. So the same surveillance that builds trust for solo creators can flatten a band's mystique. Loud, messy, transgressive. The phone is, an amplifier and it's a simple court of opinion. But it punishes certain archetypes that rock once depended on. All of the clutter, all of the distance, all of the aura, all of what rock and roll represents, the kind of danger and the sexuality of the whole thing, has been absolutely demystified and absolutely killed. And that's why there's so little anger, there's so little testosterone, there's so little, there seems to be so little just hatred in modern mainstream heavy music, hatred of the status quo, hatred of politics. Even look at Green Day or something like this. They were singing, American Idiot or whatever. And you look at the current state of pop music, it's so pathetically anodyne. It kowtows to the mainstream of public opinion so incredibly strongly. I mean, look, during COVID, you had this stories about all of the biggest influencers and biggest pop stars on a Zoom meeting with Kamala and Biden negotiating and discussing the plan and informing young people of procedure. There's so little rebellion. There's no rage against the machine. There's no rage. There's no testosterone. There's no anger. Now, I have said before that this also comes from a broadly, if you emasculate a society, then you're going to find out that after a certain amount of time that there ain't no angry guitar music. There ain't no angry music coming out of it. And that's also partly what's happened. If you make society based on, well, let's say you remove, as I said, that danger, that testosterone, that masculinity, you're not going to get a Rage Against the Machine anymore. You're not going to get a Rolling Stones. You're not going to get a Metallica. You're not going to get a Smiths. You're not going to get a Joy Division. You're not going to get any of it. And that's when somebody, my aunt or my uncle who are 10, 15 years older go, well, where are all the bands? And you go, well, unfortunately, the society that you wanted to create has meant that the outcome is that there just isn't any anger in it anymore. Or if there's anger, it's siphoned off somewhere else. So what does this all mean? It's a bit of a rambling podcast, but was there a conspiracy? A conspiracy? I mean, certainly, the music industry is about selling product and selling people, and it moves with the times. And it would just seem that technology and the algorithm and streaming, at the time, you had all of these people defending Pirate Bay, saying, it was an altruistic, empathetic, sharing platform that its sort of motivations were to bring art, to allow everyone to access art. But what it did was also screw the artist. But what it also did, I think now we can see exactly what it did to the music industry. And what it has done is just shorten everyone's attention span to something so small that it just has no place for a band. There is no place for a band within that algorithmic structure. And people say to me, oh, it'll come back eventually, that kind of thing. It won't. And while we still have festivals and are able to travel, and we still can, the touring overheads are not so insanely huge, although it is true that Live Nation and Ticketmaster are just swallowing up the entire music industry. Rock will continue to be a sort of a force of nostalgia and an underground force and a creative force. But at least in the mainstream, many things just conspired to just take it off the air. MTV, get off the air. What am I talking about? Well, indeed.
Pentagram, dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force,
Open the straits, Satan. Open the gates. It was it not? That first Dark Funeral EP. Really good EP, if I remember correctly. Must take it out and listen to it once again. Shadows over Transylvania. You got to give it to them. Those first couple of Dark Funeral, I really enjoyed them. Anyway, Open the Straits, the Great Satan, or something to that effect. A little bit later this weekend, not the normal early Friday morning, somebody told me you should release your podcast in the evening. It has more interaction, whatever that means. Do we need any more interaction in this world? I don't know. Doesn't seem so. Anyway, the wild performative theatre of 2026 just keeps on rolling. Everyone feels like they're in a simulation. Am I going to talk about Middle Eastern politics? You know what? I'm sure you're getting it. You're getting it in the ear. You're getting it in the eyes. You're getting it in the whatever remains of your grey matter constantly. So let's talk a little bit about aging musicians, about touring, let's continue the conversation about how all of this might affect the music industry that we all lounge around in and all that kind of thing. For myself, Primordial played at Inferno Festival, so I'm going to discuss the 20-year gap between the first time and this very last time. The fact that I saw Glenn Benton eating a Dorito, perhaps even more than one Dorito, who couldn't see the glory of the Lord's work in that very thing. So let's get into it. Agitators Anonymous, I'm your hostess with the very leastest. You can follow me on _Primordial if you want to take a look at my not very exciting adventures. You can look at Primordial_official if you want to look at Primordial's marginally more exciting adventures. But ultimately, it's all the same guff, is it not, my friends? Patreon.com, Alan Averill, AVERILL. If you wish to go over, there's demos, there's conversations, there's other mindless minutiae, which will, help us count the clock down until doomsday, which could be civilization ending very, very soon. So get into it. Let's get into it. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ungol. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then. Now, back to the episode. Also, if you wish to sponsor the podcast, if you wish to, if you're in a band out there and you think this might seem like a good idea to reach the ears of a relatively captive audience, then slide into my DMs. So, Inferno Festival last weekend, Primordial played. The very first time was just about, it could have been 2005 or 2006. It actually might have been 2007. My friend who is a metronomic with his understanding of dates said it was 2007. And we played for €1,000, if I'm not mistaken. And this will go to show you the difference between now and 20 years ago. Now, we, in reality, shouldn't have accepted an offer of €1,000. It was pretty insulting. And if it was 2007, then that would have been the year of To the Nameless Dead, when the band was breaking out, so to say. And if we had a breakout album now, what's interesting is that a breakout album now, let's take out a breakout band. You don't really have a breakout album, you have a breakout band because they managed to corner social media properly, whether it's a Castle Rat or this band who everyone is talking about with the polka dots, Angine de Poitrine, or whatever the hell this is. Everyone in the world saw that band because of how they looked. You know, does anybody know any songs? Not really. In fact, I'm probably repeating myself by giving out about the same thing. But you can have a breakout. You can know your band can break out without people really knowing your album. But the fact that we're in the moment of breaking out and yet still being offered such paltry money goes to show you how times have changed. Now, whether an album that broke out 20 years ago would break out anymore if you weren't very concentrated on the social media aspect of it is up for discussion, and I would imagine probably not. Even if you take a band like Mugwa, and when their breakout albums came, there was still an image to back it up, although at the same time they broke out before being on top of Instagram became such a necessity. But €1,000 and no hotel is what I remember the deal being. And a very good friend of mine from Ireland was living in Norway at the time, once singer of Solstice and singer of Arcane Sun. And he kind of put the word around like, hey, all of Primordial needs somewhere to sleep. And Agneta from Amada Mortem, a much underrated band, and a very much underrated band. I'm not one really for, I suppose you're not supposed to call it female-fronted metal anymore. Do people still say that? I suppose they do, maybe they don't. But Madame Morton was very much in the vein of a Third in the Mortal, who are back now again. Excellent bands. Anyway, she just gave us, the whole band, her front room and said, yeah, you can just stay in the front room. And without her, the show probably would never have happened. And that was around about 20 years ago. And a friend of mine after the show was like, yeah, cool show, but did you notice, the crowd reaction? I don't know, maybe it wasn't strong enough. And I kind of looked at her and I said, really? You think really the crowd reaction should be a bit different? Come on now. We're 20 years older than the very first time we played. And the crowd ages with you. In fact, you bump into the same people you knew 20 years ago. And this is when people sort of make the accusation against this element of the scene. If you look at the lineup for a festival like Inferno, there's a lot of bands who are 30 plus years old, and that would make it what people would call an old boys club. Very much you notice or you get into a cycle when you're in a band where you play festivals every summer and you see the same people, and very often the same organizational people are there, or the same people from labels. And increasingly what's happened is that the organizational side of a lot of this legacy metal scene is organized by women. But on the stage, it's still, at least for older bands, it's still the sort of gentlemen of the scene are approaching their dotage. I read something the other day that John Tardy is 58 years old. 58, still with that crazy head of hair. But 58, and I thought to myself, God damn it, I saw them with cerebral fix in Dublin in 1991 for cause of death. And they're still going. And after Primordial was Deicide. And like I said at the top of the show, You're standing around in a backstage watching Glenn Benton. Snack, no problem. We all gotta have our snacks. But you're thinking to yourself, how long can bands like that keep going on for? And they were in relatively rude health. Same with Cannibal Corpse, same with Obituary. Are these bands going to be playing brutal death metal after the age of 60? It is a very strange question because this music was so reliant on youth. It was, the very epitome of the impetuosity of youth was this old death metal scene. And you really understand it when you speak to somebody younger. Of course, you speak to younger people and they respect the old bands, they respect the classic albums. Just like when I got into, in 1988, somebody, for the first time I heard Nazareth and Budgie or Sabbath, or more specifically some of the 70s B bands. You weren't around then. And once I remember playing in Birmingham in 1994, and the only people in the crowd were the band Esoteric. Excellent band, if you don't know them. Esoteric and maybe like 3 other people. And we all sat around looking at one old dude who said, I saw Black Sabbath here in 1971. And we were amazed by that. And it was only 20 odd years. This was 1994, I think. So only a 23-year difference. Now, the year within which we sit from that 1994 meeting, surreptitious meeting, is that the right word? Probably not. Scurrilous meeting of barstool bullshitting. That is over 30 years ago. Yeah, try and get your head around that. I know it's very hard for certain people of a certain generation, but are these bands just going to keep rattling on forever? There has to be a moment where usually with death metal bands they replace the drummer. They replace the machine. They replace the industry. But Steve Asheim showed no signs of slowing up. He's solid as a rock. Same with Donald Tardy. And you think to yourself, can these bands just keep on going? Certainly, there's absolutely no doubt that we could say their commercial and creative peak might have been 30 years ago. But there's absolutely no doubt that the festival culture that we have now in the metal scene means those bands can make way more money now than they used to, because there's absolutely no way. In 1992, Deicide was touring Europe. Let's say off the back of Legion, I imagine they would be probably being paid like £500 a night or £800 a night, getting their merch sold, probably being ripped off that and coming home from a tour with maybe less than 10 grand each. And that was it. There was no festival culture like now, whereas a legacy band like a Cannibal or a Deicide or Obituary can play in front of thousands of people and headline a festival. And play, of course, maybe they're playing an album from 1994 or 1993. And I had this argument on, this debate on, with myself, of course, on the podcast a couple of months ago, which was after I saw Creator and Testament and Anthrax play to like 6,000 people in Dublin. And arguably, Creator are bigger than ever, even though one could say, well, Coma sold 300,000 copies physical or whatever back in the day. Is there creative peak from between, back in the 80s to the early 90s? I mean, I would argue that as an old fan, but I've nothing against the new stuff. But at the same time, I did see them play in Dublin in a small place called Eamon Doran's, maybe around about 2000, and there was only about 200 people there. This was 6,000 people with Anthrax, and it was a huge crowd of people. And you think to yourself, these bands are bigger than ever. So why would they just shuffle off this mortal coil? Eventually we all have to do that, do we not? But they can make a better living now. You can make a better living now being in Deicide than you probably could in 1992. Although you might have been getting a reasonable advance to record your album, you would have to do some hard touring to make some money. Although, of course, living was cheaper back then. But the point was made to me by a musician in a newer up-and-coming band who shall remain nameless to protect the innocent. Why don't some of these old bands just, basically shuffle off stage left to give the new younger bands their place in the sun? And I thought to myself, well, plenty of new younger bands are having their place in the sun. It's just from a slightly different scene and a different angle. If you're playing trad metal or death metal or something like this, then the scene is full of the old behemoth bands, and they're going to be hoovering up most of the money and the stage space and the main stage slots. However, step sideways and go into this sort of new kind of metal, whether it's Bad Omens and Ginger and all this kind of stuff. And they're all new bands and they all have their new audience. Unfortunately, I think if you've decided to don and denim vest with some patches of some classic bands, you're going to have to put up with the fact that those classic bands are still looming large over the scene. So when you go and see a traditional metal festival or a doom vibing festival, if Solitude Eternus are there, or Count Raven, or Pagan Altar, they're probably going to be after your band, and that's just kind of how it is. Or if you are Gatecreeper, you're probably, Asphyx are going to be after you. That's just the way it kind of goes. But you can see why this is such a hard thing to give up. Not only, of course, because it presents people's living. I mean, look at a band like Destruction. They are more busy than ever. They are playing all of the time. And, arguably way bigger than they were in 1988 or 1987. And what happens is that you just become used to a cycle. Every summer, the same people play the same festivals. You can go from Brutal Assault to Partisan. If you don't do it one year, you do it the next. And this is just a cycle that used to be more based around whatever album it is you were releasing. Now it might be whatever album from the past you're playing, which is a kind of interesting way of observing how the scene is aging. Someone who organizes quite a big metal festival in Germany told me, there are signs of the decline there. What is the signs of the decline? Is that not a Massacre album? The very great Massacre from France. Not a great album, I think, that one, but the first two. I digress, as is my wont. That's what you're here for, to hear me talk absolute blah, blah, blah about absolutely nothing. But Massacre, Final Holocaust and Enjoy the Violence is something that you really should listen to, because I actually think that they are coming back and playing as well. However, once upon a time, those festivals, if you were, traditional metal, or your death metal, or even Primordial, to the Nameless Dead is 20 years old. And back in those early 2000s, we were a new, upcoming and exciting, well, that's maybe not for me to say, but we were at a sort of, you have your cultural zeitgeist moment and your blip is in the middle of the radar. And you don't really realize it at the time that those are, those are the wasted years lyrics, so to speak. But that eventually you will move off the radar, and if you're lucky, you'll become a legacy band. And then you're kind of looking backwards over your career. And it's something you have to just make peace with. There's no way around it. And it's been an interesting journey to transition into something like that over the last couple of years. It's a bit difficult because, like I said, you do realize that the main body of your work is in the past. Not only of your work, of your life, but that the last Primordial album was the first one to exist in this different climate, shall we say, this complete and utter deluge of music everywhere. And you realize, like, oh, okay, you've had your moment in the sun, so to speak. Nothing wrong with raging against the dying of the light. And of course, I'm not saying we're not going to make another album or that kind of thing. But next year will be 20 years of To the Nameless Dead, and people are starting to ask us to play the album, to play the old albums. Now, that was something years ago I would have been against. But now, I think because it's pretty much all still the same members, I think, well, you know what? We made that record. We can do whatever we want with it. And also there are plenty of people who never saw us back then at the time. And it doesn't feel like the wrong thing to do. But what you do realize is that you're part of a scene that's aging. Whether you take all the bands who are our contemporaries in that sort of pagan adjacent scene to black metal, whether it was Einherjar or Tyrfing or Ancient Rites, Aeternus, Enslaved, Drudk. Of course, you walk into the backstage and the first person you see at Inferno is Grutla from Enslaved. And many, many moments recently, somebody said, oh, by the way, have you heard it's such and such's birthday? And that birthday is going to be 50. I'm sure amongst the Deicide Cannibal Corpse obituary, all of them and all their crew, all the Exoduses and all those testaments, I'm sure some of them are now going, oh, well, it's Chuck Billy's 65th or 63rd or 62nd. Gary Holt might be 58, 59, 60, because they're a bit older than the death metal generation. The death metal generation are like, oh, if someone's 57, 60. And I'm sure it must be on everybody's mind, like, how long more does this keep going on for? But by anybody's estimation, the festival culture that exists points to a relative system of rude health, I suppose. Now, you might remember I was discussing the fact that I was going to do a split podcast with Cheyenne from Trivax and Iblis Manifestations about free speech. Well, we did that. Ex Niven, they were very nice to us, and they were cool enough to open the bar a little bit early. And we had about 30 people come down to listen to me and him waffle, for me to push through my hangover. And will I ever learn? No, probably not, is the truth. But we had a pretty good discussion, to say the least. And that's something that's going to be either here on the podcast or up on YouTube. You're going to be able to watch that soon enough. So maybe it was a bit pointless me mentioning it. But if you were there, thanks very much.
A rare and infuriating... Have you ever met someone so catastrophically foolish that all reason in you paused, and the only thought left was the urge to reach out and smack the stupidity right off their face? A rare and infuriating...
So, right now here in Dublin, we're having farmers start to protest about the cost of fuel, that kind of thing. Ireland doesn't have any reserves. I'm not going to start talking about Irish politics or all that kind of stuff, but it might be a portend of things to come. And so I'm going to let's discuss a little bit about energy, and then I'll try and get into how this may affect the music industry, you as a consumer of music. That sounded a bit weird, but okay. So let's try and talk about this properly for a moment, because there's a lot of noise flying around and people jump straight into, are we about to run out of fuel? And that's kind of probably the wrong question. The short answer, I think, is not imminently. But this Iran situation is the first time in a while where that question isn't crazy. It's not the same as the Ukraine and Russia conflict. Right now, what's actually, off the top of my aging dome, what's actually happening is less about Europe directly and more about a choke point in the global system, I think. Because, of course, through the Straits of Hormuz, only 20% of the world's oil and petrol comes from. Most of Europe gets theirs from different areas. But the Strait of Hormuz is one of these arteries of the world economy. Huge volumes of oil and gas pass through it every single day. And when that gets disrupted, even partially, the effects ripple out everywhere. It's been interesting to go back and read a bit about the Suez Canal crisis, actually. And this is a sort of Cold War era confrontation. It's 1956, or is it 58? 56. Egypt, Israel, Britain and France. And it marked the end of Britain and France as dominant imperial powers in the Middle East. And it totally reshaped global politics. What's that guy's name? The Egyptian guy? Nasser. He nationalized the Suez Canal, which had previously been controlled by the British and the French. And so they all attacked Egypt. Britain, France and Israel, they all attacked Egypt and pretty much overwhelmed them. But politically, the whole plan collapsed. And you can see some sort of echoes in what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz, I think. And of course, the Soviet Union threatened intervention on the Egyptian side, but it had that Cold War sort of element to it, which at the moment, what's happening doesn't seem to have, because China and Russia are sort of sitting back and observing what's happening. And this guy, Nasser, he emerged as a hero of Arab nationalism, actually. And the whole Middle East became a sort of battleground for Cold War interests, including quite a lot of socialist politics spreading throughout the region. So it's been quite interesting to sort of look back through that. And also, as I said before on the podcast, defending a strait. This is, you can go back to antiquity and see the issues and the problems, the Peloponnesian War, whatever it was, and how difficult it is to defend a strait. And now, how difficult it must be to defend a strait when you've got an army of cheap drones coming to destroy your very expensive military hardware, But sure, can't they get restocks anyway? And sure aren't the lads who supply all the military hardware. Sure, haven't they only got everyone's best interests at heart? Indeed, they have. Anyway, prices move first. They always do. Oil jumps and the gas follows, and suddenly everything from transport to electricity to food starts inching upward. And that's a system reacting in real time. But now here's the key thing I think people sometimes miss. Europe doesn't need to be buying Iranian oil for this to hurt. It's a global market. If supply tightens anywhere, everyone starts competing harder for what's left. So Europe ends up bidding against Asia, against everyone, especially. That's where it kind of gets interesting and also very uncomfortable. I think in the short term, say the next few weeks, you're not looking at shortages. You're looking at higher prices. That's the release valve, and it could get very ugly. For example, here, and the government is threatening to send in the military to get rid of the farmers' protests. This could be something very serious. And also, Ireland could be this canary in the coal mine for the rest of Europe, because if you remember, there were some farmers' protests a couple of years back. It seemed to be a bit of a sort of, what were we calling it at the time? A sort of World Economic Forum plan of the retaking of farmers' lands. I think you would, in the old Soviet terms, say it was the seizing of the means of production. Anyway, don't worry, I'm going to stop talking about it in a moment and get on to how it might affect the heavy metal, which is, of course, the most important thing. But where it comes genuinely serious is if disruption drags on for months and starts interfering with the normal refill cycle, especially gas storage heading into winter. That's when you stop talking about price problems and start talking about allocation. Who gets energy, who doesn't? Industry usually gets it first. Will that be prioritised over households? It's a sign that things have moved into a different phase. Are the Irish government going to try and do a Trudeau at what he did on the truckers? Are they going to start seizing farmers' assets? I would say if it hasn't happened already, we're going to start to see the government call the farmers far right. That seems to be the usual playbook, but could be coming to a city near you very soon. For somewhere like Ireland, you feel, this a bit more sharply. There's no big buffer here, no massive storage sitting there. We don't have reserves. It's just an in-time system tied into the UK and global flows. So when things tighten, it shows up faster, usually in the price first. And it's been going up and up and up here. And now, of course, everybody's looking for everything to be subsidised. If this situation de-escalates or clears up in a matter of weeks, it's a price shock, and that's it, painful and manageable. If it drags into months, you start to see real strain. But what I'm perhaps more interested in having a look at while we reach the end of the podcast is how this could affect the music industry, because let's be honest, you've probably had it up to your eyeballs with hearing about the war. I see so many people just seem to have completely logged out of it. I get that. It's been an absolute wild ride to the year, and I think anyone who thought, well, Trump's going to come in, maybe he'll just, take a bit of a hammer to some of the DEI stuff, and, maybe they championed him as a sort of an enemy of the woke or all this kind of stuff. Well, and you thought he was going to maybe sit back and just not drag the world to the precipice of World War III. It seems you've been mistaken, because this whole year has just felt like going at 100 miles an hour, and there just doesn't seem to be any end to the insane performative theatre of modern politics. But let's extend this into something a bit closer to Agitators Anonymous home, and that is, what does all of this actually mean for music, for bands, for gigs, for the whole ecosystem around touring? Because this is where it starts to get real very, very quickly. And I've just been having this conversation today with some friends of mine in a band who are planning a tour in September and October, and they're talking about nightliners and this and that and the other. And what a lot of the agencies and people are discussing is, how do we try and hold companies to the deals that we've made with them now when it comes to September? Because Primordial has been in that position where we've fixed a deal with a bus company, and then 10 days beforehand, because they know you won't be able to find an alternative, they go, by the way, we're rising the price by 15%. And you just have to suck it up. And of course, it comes from the band's bottom end. Nobody else is going to go, the crew or the agency don't go, well, you know what, we'll take less money. It just comes out of the band's bottom end, so to speak. And so start with the obvious. Touring runs on fuel. Well, I mean, look, all of us run on energy, do we not? And touring runs on fuel. Vans, buses, trucks, flights, it's all energy. And not just a bit of it, a lot of it. Especially at the mid-tier level, where margins are already thin. The mid-tier level, where bands like Primordial, like my own bands, exist. In the short term, same as before, you're looking at price pain, not cancellations. Price pain. Fuel costs go up. Flights get more expensive. I can already see that. And big time, you want to fly in and out for a weekend. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, Inferno was €1,000 before. And I remember we used to be able to fly in and out of, what was the airport? Sandefjord or whatever it was, a Ryanair one. And you could get, I think we got there for 109 each. They weren't merciless about the guitars and luggage back then. And we were able to come out still and have €200 or €300, I think, of that €1,000 back in the day to buy something to eat and all that kind of stuff. Flights are going to get more expensive. I see this. There's quite a few flights I've seen coming back from, major European cities from one to the other, like, say, Paris, Brussels, Dublin. And there's a couple of Monday flights I've seen during summer that are already hitting €650, €750. Haulage costs increase. Promoters feel it. Bands feel it. The crews definitely feel it. In fact, I was having a big discussion with a friend of mine about being more or less stay-at-home crew. As in, what happened during lockdown was a different thing. People couldn't make money from traveling. Now you're going to have to try and make your money from being the, the front of house of the lights at a venue in your city. Now, of course, that's still relying on bands to come through, but I think we're going to see the fees of crew going up and up and up, like stay-at-home crew. So if you're a band who are coming through Dublin, or let's say you're coming through London, you're coming through Paris, you're coming through Berlin, and you've got a monitor guy or monitor woman, they're going to be looking for up to €400, I think, for that evening's work, if not more. All things will be adjusted. Obviously, things are adjusted for inflation, except the fee of the bands. So promoters feel it, bands feel it, crews definitely feel it, but shows still go ahead. They just become less profitable, or in some cases barely viable, and the merch is going to go up. You're going to be paying €50 for a t-shirt. And that's the key shift. It's not no gigs. It's harder to make gigs work. Now stretch that out over a couple of months. Airlines start adjusting. Routes get more expensive, maybe less frequent. Cargo costs rise. Suddenly flying a band in gear across Europe or worse to the US becomes a serious financial decision again. Not just a logistical pain in the arse, but a serious financial pain in the arse. And what bands are going to start doing is not bringing crew with them. So if you're sitting out there listening to me as a front of house or lights, a lampy, or that's what they call the lights people, lampies. If you're one of those, you better start trying to look for a local venue to work in as a backup, I think, if you're used to touring a lot, because it might not be happening as much. Because if you're relying on a band to fly you out, let's say you are, I've got a magazine in front of me, let's pick a band from the front of it, Deceased, Monstrosity, Venom are on the front. If let's say Venom are flying out, well, Venom are a pretty big band, but let's just say they're flying out to Hellfest for a one-off show, and all of a sudden all the crew flights are 500 or 600 in and out for the weekend, and Kronos sits down and he goes, right, so 500, 600 in and out, and 300 or 400 for the pay for the day. All of a sudden, if you bring in 5 crew, you're losing €5,000. I don't think Mr. Conrad Lant is going to sit there and go, okay, we're just willing to lose that. Oh, of course, if they're charging 5,000 more in their fee, perhaps, to compensate for that. But for a lot of bands, bringing somebody in and out for the weekend is going to become very hard. So people are going to have to try and find other jobs at home. I could be talking to myself right here, right now. Festivals start feeling it too. The entire model depends on flying acts in from all over the world. If those costs spike hard enough, you either raise ticket prices, which of course has limits because people are feeling the pain as well. They're going through many costs. Also, don't forget, every summer for festival season, lots of people drive around from festival to festival to festival. That's probably going to, start coming down as well. People are going to go, well, can we really afford to follow this around every weekend? They're going to cut costs somewhere else. There's going to maybe less stages, more local bands. I mean, this means if you're in the Benelux, and you're an up-and-coming band, a really good band like, say, Schizophrenia or Butcher or something, you're going to be getting a lot more calls to get in your car and come down and drive. Cut somewhere else, and somewhere else usually means fewer bands, smaller lineups, less risk-taking on anything that isn't a guaranteed draw. So those bands in the middle or at the beginning who festivals took a chance on and were willing to spend 2 or 3 or 4,000 euro on bringing them in, you might be in trouble. Then there's the middle class of music, the bands that used to shift 20 to 50,000 records, that play to, let's say, 300 to 1,000 capacity rooms and live off touring. Well, very few of them live off touring, but they're able to make some sort of cottage industry of, maybe making half their income, and then the rest of the year they work in a guitar shop or work at something else. They're not making a living. They're having, they could be making 30 to 50% compensatory towards their overall yearly income. Crumbs of income. They're already under pressure from streaming economics. Yep. This kind of shock hits them the hardest, and that is where Primordial sits. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Big acts will absorb the shocks. Small acts hustle through them because they never really made any money anyway, and mid-tier acts get squeezed out. If fuel and travel costs stay high for long enough, you're going to start to see shorter tours, more regional routing, fewer zigzag tours across countries, bands skipping, for example, Ireland altogether because unless it's financially solid. But Ireland's probably a bad example, but they're going to skip countries that are geographically difficult to get down to. If you've got a big 10-hour, 12-hour drive to get down to Rome, you're not going to go to Rome. And flying specifically becomes a pressure point. A lot of bands fly because they have to. Yeah, that's Primordial. Time constraints, routing, geography. But if flight costs spike or routes tighten, you'll see a shift back toward overland touring where possible. Not in our case. Slower, more deliberate, maybe even fewer shows. Now push it even further. Let's go even further into that more severe, prolonged distribution scenario of energy. This is where it starts to resemble what happened during past crises, even COVID, just via a different mechanism. Insurance costs will rise. Promoters become risk averse. Advance guarantees get tighter. Tours get cancelled not because they can't happen, but because they don't make any financial sense anymore. Yeah, this is where an awful lot of discussions are happening now, because to hire a van and a driver 10 years ago, you could probably do that for 150 euro a day. Try doing that now, and you're going to be charged 3 or 4, sometimes 500 euro a day. Fewer tours overall, fewer international acts moving freely, more pressure on ticket prices. An audience already dealing with higher living costs from energy inflation start pulling back too. So you get hit from both sides. Costs up, demand becomes more shaky. So the bottom line on the music side is very similar to the energy side. Seeing as we might as well talk about it. If this is a short-lived shock, it's just more expensive touring for a while. People grumble, they absorb it, they try and find ways around it, and they move on. And in a lot of cases, those, some areas of this industry are not going to let a good, a good war go to waste, a good crisis go to waste. So the percentages they charge you more for hiring backline to vans to wherever, they're not going to bring those prices down when this the crisis ends. That's just not the way things work, If you remember, and I always think about this, the volcano which downed all of Europe's airlines, and the prices went up and up and up, and they never really came back down after that volcano period. And the airlines will use the same logic, the same thing. They'll go, well, we're here now, and people are still paying for the flights, so we're not going to bring it back down, are we? It just makes things more expensive for a while. But if it drags on for months, could be years. The Ukraine war is now in its 5th year, right? And it's still just trudging on. You will start to see structural changes. Fewer tours, tighter margins, more cautious booking. And if it becomes prolonged distribution, then you're looking at a real squeeze on the live music economy, especially that middle layer that's already been under pressure for years. But I guess Spotify might come to our rescue and pay us properly for all of those streams so we can have another revenue income. Oh, well. It won't be the end of touring, but definitely a step back from the kind of fluid global circuit that bands had gotten used to, and especially that began to come back into focus after COVID and lockdown. And that, for anyone in the world, that's where this stops being abstract geopolitics and starts being very, very real. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, I thank you all. My brain surgery is done for the week. I will go back into my dungeon lair. Perhaps I'll bash out a Dungeon Synth album. Who knows? Who knows? I certainly have enough ridiculous hats to be able to wear for inspiration. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, spread the word. If you think you know someone who would be really irritated by this podcast, send it on to them. And I'll see you all next week.